Pleasure to welcome you and to moderate today's program, which is going to be the first in a series sponsored by the Taube Philanthropies of a discussion on American values. This is going to be a 2-year project underwritten by the Taube Philanthropies of California. The object is to identify the basic values that underlie American democracy and then talk about how we can best convey those values to students from K right through graduate university students. The first year is going to look at American democracy and citizen participation. Today's session will be about the meaning of American democracy, the questions about what are the core values that underlie our democracy. Have values such as freedom, individual initiative, self-reliance, freedom of inquiry, and civil discourse changed? Are they changing? Should they change? We will have our next session in San Francisco this coming February on the rights and responsibilities of a citizen in the American democracy, because we feel strongly that while children are taught today about their rights as citizens, all too few are taught about their responsibilities as citizens, something that's particularly relevant in this presidential election year. And year 2 will be addressed to the questions of how precisely to impart those values that we have identified in year 1. Do the answers lie in curricula, teaching methods, alternative structures? How best do we go about educating our next generations? I'm particularly pleased that this morning's session will be keynoted, as the entire series will, by President Donna Shalala. And I will just say that those of you who are here in the room have little biographies of all of the speakers, so I'm not going to introduce them at length. Those of you watching on webcast can come to our website if you like and get more information about all of the speakers. President Donna Shalala of the University of Miami was previously president of Hunter College of the City University of New York, as well as chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is perhaps best known as having served for 8 years as Secretary of Health and Human Services, in which capacity she was also a member of the Woodrow Wilson Board of Directors. And as I said, she will be giving our keynote speech. She will be followed by Moses Boyd, sitting to my left, who is principal in the Integrated Solutions Group of the Washington Group, who is a former counsel to the United States Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and who is also a former public policy scholar here at the center. He'll be followed by Peter Levine, who is director of CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, as well as research director of Tufts University's Jonathan Tisch College of Citizenship and Public Service. Each of our panelists will speak, and then the floor will be open for your questions and some dialogue. With that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to President Shalala.
Thank you very much, Flip. I think I will use the podium. I think the Woodrow Wilson Center will make the formal presentation available.
Yes,
okay.
It'll be online.
Let me start by thanking Woodrow Wilson for rescheduling this. It was a little embarrassing, but I was actually offered the Presidential Medal of Freedom 5 days before I was scheduled to do this before, and my good friend Lee Hamilton said, you can't turn that down. So I do apologize for those of you that might have shown up at the earlier presentation. Flip and I are old friends from CUNY, and I was delighted when I received the invitation to talk about citizen participation in American democracy. It's such a relief not to talk about Medicare reimbursement rates. These days I'm only invited to talk about health policy, which I did last night, and all the questions were about whether the cardiologists were going to get more money, not about the broad questions of the uninsured. So that's getting pretty boring. Since neither of the candidates are saying very much about health care, it's hard to answer detailed questions from an audience. I'd like to start with a story. I read it first in Gertrude Stein's The Making of Americans. There was a son dragging his father down the road by the hair, and the father kept yelling, "Stop, stop!" And the son kept dragging him. And finally, in fury and in outrage, the father cried, "Stop! I didn't drag my father beyond this tree." The story, of course, is a metaphor. Hold that metaphor. It has something to do with the dialectic of democracy in this restless republic of ours. Sometimes it has to be pulled by the hair to go forward, and often it's a generational pull. Seldom is it very easy. Now, add that to what we know about George Mason, who was the Virginia delegate to the Constitutional Convention some 220 years ago. He didn't sign the Constitution. He opposed its ratification because he believed it didn't sufficiently oppose slavery or safeguard individual rights. History vindicated him with the Bill of Rights. This may be the first Woodrow Wilson lecture in which includes Gertrude Stein and George Mason. But the two of them shared something really important, and that is an understanding that freedom is indivisible, that the only way to defend it is to permit it, and even and especially at times like these, when war and anxiety and fear are in the air, when libraries and words start to be watched, that's usually a prelude to a crackdown on other rights and other liberties. And sure enough, starting 7 years ago, an American president moved to restrict our rights because of fear of terrorism. The American people and the Congress quietly let that pass, like the dog that didn't bark in the Sherlock Holmes story. This trimming of rights ought to enrage our citizens. But after a despicable attack called 9/11, the state of our post-September 11th democracy seemed to me very frail, very subdued, and very timorous. We collectively lost the noise, the buoyancy, the confidence of a healthy democracy. So spooked were we as citizens that on most college campuses there were no anti-war demonstrations. Even after the polls showed widespread disaffection with the war, there were no demonstrations on most college campuses in this country. And so, as we anticipate a new president and a new page in this country's story, I want to identify the hurt parts of our body politic, places that need some shoring up. If they were here today, my friends Gertrude Stein and George Mason would say, the making of Americans is not a part-time job. Let America be America again. Let it dream. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be, wrote the poet Langston Hughes. I would only add that America could only be America again when we start acting more like Americans. Joining them at the imaginary table of past greats are two authors of political classics. Alex de Tocqueville, the French author of Democracy in America in 1835, and President John F. Kennedy with his famous Profiles in Courage. Then there's a personal favorite of mine, Margaret Chase Smith, the Lady of Maine, who was the first senator, the first politician to speak out against the rising tide of McCarthyism in 1950. I once had the pleasure of meeting her and giving a speech paying tribute to her public service, but it began with my secretary at Wisconsin coming in and saying, there's someone named Margaret Chase Smith on the phone. Do you know her? And I said, I don't. And my secretary said, I never heard of her either. I said, no, I've heard of her. And I took the call, and she was asking me to come out and give her 90th birthday speech, and she was an admirer of mine. I was deeply touched, and I rushed immediately to Maine to do whatever Margaret Chase Smith wanted me to do. But I want to talk a little about the context. I think it's important that we remember that for Americans, freedom of speech, of religion, the right to assemble or to petition the government or to redress grievances, and, of course, freedom of the press are not privileges are not privileges or benefits granted and capable of being rescinded. They are rights guaranteed by our Constitution in a free society. In his travels across the country, de Tocqueville, of course, observed what was unusual among Americans, and he, of course, describes this in very vivid detail. He studied the Constitution in both senses of the world. In 1787, the federal document, but also our habits and our customs and our traits as political animals. The New England town meeting was a source of amazement to him, perhaps the heartbeat of democracy and self-government in its purest form, and at heart was participation, the very thing that we seek in this country and think of as a holy grail. He was quick to see how the checks and balance of power operated in practice, and he shrewdly noted the individual rights championed by George Mason and others had some teeth right from the start. And of course, he was writing about the early 19th century. The power of courts of justice to strike down a law as unconstitutional, he described as one of the most powerful barriers that have been devised against the tyranny of political assemblies. De Tocqueville was also way ahead of his time in praising a social class that was on paper powerless in America. If I were asked to what the singular prosperity and growing strength of that people ought mainly to be attributed, I should reply, the superiority of their women. Alexis and I are also old friends. Finally, he admired our optimistic view of the future and our faith in perfectibility. So let's not lose sight of that kind of sturdy innocence as we walk through the other chapters in our history. President Kennedy also held up the 19th century republic to close scrutiny, and he too was fascinated by the minority versus the majority. The era he examined, of course, with very discernible insight, was mostly Civil War, the Civil War period, when we were splitting at the seams. Being a senator at the time, he wrote profiles in Courage. It's important to remember, almost 50 years ago. Those who naturally caught his imagination were elected officials, senators, as it happened. Those who stood up to waves of pressure and fury from their fellow senators, from their own party, and from the larger forces in our society. Well, there were not a whole lot of them, and they were not always on the right side of history. Kennedy profiled 8 courageous senators. One was the orator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. Another was Sam Houston of Texas. Each man flew alone in the face of overwhelming opposition from his enemies, but from friends and constituents as well. It's important to remember that a man like Sam Houston had an extraordinary impact on our history when he said, "I know neither North or South, I know only the Union." And he was denounced by everyone at the time. But let me talk about a third, the little-known Edmund Ross from Kansas. In the heat of binding up the Civil War wounds and the still simmering sectional divide, quiet Edmund Ross saved the presidency of Andrew Johnson because he voted against impeachment. He was committed to as fair a trial as an accused man ever had. He was hounded day and night by Kansans and by a maddening crowd. But he did just this. As he told the story, I almost literally looked down into my open grave. He died penniless, a man who stood up for fairness. He was about right. His impeachment vote fell. The impeachment vote just fell 1 vote short of conviction in 1868. And of course, he was accused of being a Judas-like traitor to his own Republican Party. Impeaching a president, as we know, can roil a republic even on a good day. And whether it was Webster or Houston or Ross, all of them put the national interest above their own. There are no constitutional protections for lawmakers alone against the crowd inside the political assemblies. De Tocqueville warned against which de Tocqueville warned against. And unlike individual dissenters and minorities in civil society, they are pretty much on their own to suffer the rough justice of colleagues and voters back home. That's why I've always said the President Kennedy's book is a short book, because there aren't a lot of senators or members of Congress. They tend to be gregarious team players, not loners. One single standing vote of conscience remains a rare moment in an institution more apt to compromise the traditionally art of American democracy. Moving ahead to the 20th century, the chapter on Japanese American intern camps is also an extraordinary period of time. And President Roosevelt, who is otherwise beloved as a wonderful president, was responsible there. There were very few critics at that time, and the Supreme Court upheld his order. Cycles of fear in the 40s continued to churn and started breaking up again when the Cold War started. Fear of a clear enemy abroad is one thing, but of an insidious fear of an invisible enemy in everyday life is quite another. That is the place where we Americans get scared easily, and at the same time, we have been most willing to tailor our freedoms, not just those belonging to others, but those belonging to ourselves. And that is the extraordinary thing about what happens when we get afraid as Americans. We tailor our own freedoms. That's what I meant about freedom being individual. What you lose today, I will lose tomorrow. And that is far scarier than being dragged down the road by your hair. By the 1950s, the enemy had changed to the Soviet Union. And that was, of course, a certain senator named Joseph McCarthy worked during that period. Just by naming un-American names, holding hearings, making accusations that were aired in millions of homes, and claiming the existence of conspiracies to undermine the safety and the security of the United States, he got his power. The power of insuation, a power in which he let loose, which ended in a kind of hysteria in Washington. Blacklisting became the rage. And here's where Senator Margaret Chase Smith, a Republican, rides into the story. She figured out the sham of McCarthyism before almost any other public figure. And June 1st, 1950, she gave her Declaration of Conscience speech on the Senate floor. McCarthy sat there and listened to every word. It astonished her. I actually asked her about that. She said she was stunned. He sat right in front of her as she made this speech. In her opening remarks, she went straight to the heart of the matter. And I quote, "A national feeling of fear and frustration that could result in national suicide and the end of everything that we Americans hold dear." Specifically, she said, the right of independent thought was in danger, along with the right to criticize, to hold unpopular beliefs, and the right to protest. The American people are sick and tired of being afraid to speak their minds, lest they be politically smeared as communists or fascists, she said. And in a flight of eloquence which was unusual for her, she said she did not wish to see her party ride to victory on the four horsemen of calumny, fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear. Those are the kinds of words that I believe that our young people need to hear, that they need to read and to understand to elevate not just their test scores, but their understanding of democracy and its perils. For the record, McCarthy, of course, was finally censured in 1954, which was 4 long, dark years for the Senate and the nation to catch up to Senator Smith's Declaration of Conscience. Her words did not stop his deeds. Yet sometimes all we have to go by is the light of a single clear conscience when our civil liberties are under siege. I believe that the 21st century has not been the best of times. Again, we wavered at a critical juncture, and constitutional rights and freedoms and casualties of the terrorism attacks 7 years ago. Is it fair to say that terrorism is the new communism? September 11th, 2001 scared the bejesus out of our people. As soon as the war on terrorism was declared by the president, the so-called Patriot Act was not far behind in October. The atmosphere was so electric with shock and charged with grief that nary a word was expressed in dissent. We as a people were very easily led. By its very name, the Patriot Act suggested that those who opposed it were not loyal, trustworthy Americans. The oldest trick in the book. It became the law of the land after passing 98-1. One senator, Senator Russell Feingold of Wisconsin, was in good company with himself, and he explained his vote. The founders, he wrote, the founders wrote an explicit Bill of Rights to protect liberty in times of war as well as in times of peace. Citing some of the same episodes, such as the 20th century internment and blacklisting, he said, we must not allow these pieces of the past to become prologue. There's always one vote or one voice, a George Mason, a Margaret Chase Smith in the March of Civilization. And I know I'm asking a lot of the new generation of young people to emulate them. So be it. I feel very comfortable asking a lot from this new millennium generation. Democracy in America, after a sustained assault on liberty, is languishing. It's frankly more frail and vulnerable than we ever learned or taught in school. Yet, as a university president, I have reason to hope for our democracy recovering its vitality. I sense a yearning out there for a reinvention and a reclaiming of American democracy. There are hints in the voter turnout of young people who were barely in their teens on September 11th, 2001. They are starting to get it, that they can and must take some ownership of the process to influence it. The last two election cycles saw sharp increases in the youth voter turnout rates, and even better, compared to 2004, young adults turnout tripled in the 2008 Iowa caucuses and nearly tripled in the New Hampshire primary. With the internet and texting as new ways to invigorate the youth vote, the Obama campaign has stirred and invigorated participation among young people. In turn, young Democrats were his strongest supporters in the primary season. He has clearly captured their imaginations with different ways of communicating, like telling supporters that Barack has chosen Senator Biden as his running mate through a late-night text message instead of through the press. In general, young Americans are increasingly likely to be engaged politically, and as recently as 2006, they started to shift their votes in favor of Democrats. That said, most young adults still profess a moderate ideology rather than being liberals or conservatives. Young Democratic voters are the most racially and ethnically diverse voting bloc, and gender differences are clear in this cohort. The turnout rate among young women was nearly 7 percentage points higher than young men in recent presidential elections. The MTV-CBS poll found that the economy is by far the most important issue to this group. They're worried about their futures. We're talking about 44 million eligible voters between the ages of 18 and 29 who could get into the game, though they're not equally energized across the states. There was one state where there were only 300 young people who bothered to show up for a presidential primary, Tennessee. I learned a lot from teaching, and I'm optimistic about this new generation and the new media. As long as there is free speech and communication in the public square, then the form it comes in is secondary. As long as dissent is not silenced, and as long as everyone feels entitled to speak their piece, we should welcome this as a vital sign. As a professor, I have student chat rooms and blogs in my courses. I wonder what de Tocqueville would have made of that kind of participation. Here's a guess. He said, America is a land of wonders in which everything is in constant motion and every change seems an improvement. True, he also said, they admit that what appears to them today to be good may be superseded by something better tomorrow. We like to think that rosy optimism applies to American democracy, but that would be wrong. Democracy is really like a garden. It needs fresh infusions to stay vibrant. It needs more than a brave few to tend and defend in all its seasons when we are told that there is war at home or an enemy within. The perennials of American constitutional rights and civil liberties are too precious to let light go without a fight, to be here today and gone tomorrow. For let me remind you, what you lose today, I will lose tomorrow. What I lose today, you will lose tomorrow. Democracy requires great and courageous individuals, but in the end, it is a collective act. Unlike the Europeans or the Russians, we Americans have no history of kings. We have no history of czars or tyrants or autocrats. We have no history of authoritarian rulers who claim to take care of us and control us in the process. In American democracy, we take care of ourselves, which means that we have to take care of one another. We Americans are a political nation, built not on an ethnic or even a linguistic heritage, but a foundation of rights. Those rights make us who we are. But if we can't use them, then we will lose them. And we need them more when we are anxious and afraid than we are certain and secure. That is my message for this new generation and for all of us to remember. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Shalala. Thoroughly enjoyed your address, and having read your comments beforehand, I'd like to give some commentary. But let me take the time to thank the Woodrow Wilson International Center for the invitation and opportunities to speak today. Philippa and Donna and others that I see that I work with when I served here as a public policy scholar. And good morning to all of you, and thank you for coming. Obviously, this is a timely topic in this election season of our country, and what a fascinating election that we are witnessing. But like any election, it conjures up the questions about the meaning of American democracy and the meaning of America. The issue was raised by President Shalala and Philippa in an opening address as to the value systems and how do we ensure that we uphold the right value systems in an effort to sustain our democracy. And I think the values are clear. The values of liberty and equality and justice for all. They were created in the beginning and they remain with us today. The challenge is, what do we do to uphold those values and to make sure that they remain vibrant and potent and applicable throughout time? And I think that's where sometimes there's a missing link between what our values are and the state of our nation. And if we examine just several of the issues that President Shalala raised that are critical to the health of our democracy, the right of dissent and the maintenance of individual freedom, even in moments of intense crises fueled by supermajoritarian support and mass opinion toward a particular point of view or mode of action, the importance of an informed public and expanded youth involvement in the political process. So how do we make sure that we are able to meet all of these challenges? And I think one way is to deal with what I believe may be an issue that contributes sometimes to some apathy in our social activism, and that is what I believe is a misconception of American history. I think sometimes it is suggested that America was great from the beginning. What is true is that America created the highest ideas of human governance and human existence, and the ideals that were laid down by the Declaration of Independence and then codified by the Constitution. But that did not make us great. All that did is created the goals and aspirations. It has taken a lot of effort for us to fulfill that. And throughout history, there have been continuous efforts by people to make sure that we brought our nation in line with those ideas. And they have been reflected in the great movements that have shaped our country: the anti-slavery movement, the labor rights movement, the women's rights movement, the consumer rights movement, the immigrants' rights movement, the conservative movement, the gay and human rights movement that we witness today. All of these movements have one thing in common. They're all designed to make sure that we bring our nation in line with the ideals that we claim that we live by. And that points to another, I think, drawback that we sometimes find in our teaching, which is that America is not great by declaration or by fiat. It is great because it has taken because it requires a lot of hard work of us to ensure that we meet the standards that we have set for ourselves. We often take for granted the sacrifices that people have made to make this country what it is today. Not just the sacrifices by those who were part of the great movements that I just identified, but the sacrifices of people who bleed for this country, who bled for it internally, whether we're talking about the Native Americans, whether we're talking about Japanese Americans that were interned, whether we're talking about long dissenters that are never mentioned in history books but may have lost their jobs or their lives because they stood up for something right. It may have been just a local issue, and so we miss them. But if we begin to understand that democracy takes work, and the kind of democracy that we have created, the highest form of it in the world, that we dare to live by, that the Europeans ridiculed at the time that we created and said that it would never work, that it has taken a lot of work, a lot of sacrifice, and a lot of suffering to make this possible. Clearly, we cannot ignore the sacrifices of those who have fought in our wars, from the Revolutionary War to the 20th century wars, the Vietnam War, the Gulf Wars, and those who are sacrificing their lives today in an effort to preserve the status of our world today and the freedoms that we enjoy today. So I think that one way in which we can ensure that our republic remains and remains strong and that we meet the standards that we have set for ourselves is to appreciate the kind of commitment it takes to sustain it and the sacrifices that have been made by those who have preceded us. If you then address the question, then what is the solution then to deal with this, what we believe is sort of constant apathy and non-activism at times? And I think at least there are three solutions. One, we have to maintain a commitment to civic engagement. President Shalala referenced the excitement and increase in voting by young people that Senator Obama's campaign has stirred. And that is great, and it is admirable, and it's great to see that. The question is it tied to Senator Obama? It's an ephemeral movement that will die down if he does not win or when his presidency has ended. The issue is what will have to be done to sustain that kind of involvement, because we are a young nation. We're going through a lot of transitions and we'll meet greater challenges in the future. And at some point, all of us in this room will have to turn this nation over to the next generations. Are they prepared to lead this nation? And that's another reason why I think history is so important when you look at this from a generational standpoint and deal with this issue that we often take our history for granted, because we should not look upon lightly what it took years ago for people to get through the hardships that we confronted, from those who came through the Middle Passage, from the Pilgrims, from the toil in the factories, in every place in this country. What it took for our foreparents to create the kind of nation that we have today, the grit and determination. So the question is, are the generations before us prepared to meet that kind of challenge? Because I think the challenges in the future will be even greater. So the activism that we see today is wonderful. I think the challenge is to make sure that we do whatever is necessary to sustain it. We're going to have to maintain a free and objective press. The new media that President Shalala referenced is great, and it's certainly generated a lot more access to information and stirred a lot of excitement and involvement. But also we have to understand that it may have the potential to continue to produce polarization, as folks may sometimes gravitate to media that reinforces their own view. And so the challenge is to make sure that not only do we maintain an expanded press, but one that is also objective and recognizes the value of dissent. And clearly, education is critical, as the history lessons that we just surveyed are so important to that. But again, I think the overarching lesson that I at least like to point out, and that I think is very critical, is that we understand it's going to take a lot of work to maintain the health of American democracy and to maintain the status of America in this world. In his inaugural address in 1961, President Kennedy challenged us with the words, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That was important then, and is as important today. I relate that to my own personal experience as an African American whose ancestors were enslaved. And the question is, what does the nation owe me? It owes me nothing. The question is, what do I owe it, and what do I owe my ancestors to fulfill their dreams and fulfill the ideas of our country? Thank you very much.
Good morning, and I join my two colleagues in thanking you for all being here and for the invitation, and I certainly enjoyed both of those talks and look forward to the discussion, so I won't take much of your time. But I wanted to, after simply saying that I endorse everything that's been said so far, add two fairly simple supportive points, but I think 2 points that haven't been made so far. One is that we do actually know how to teach young people to be what we could call good citizens. We could certainly debate what's most important in the package of values and attitudes and behaviors that we call being a good citizen, but there's a lot of overlapping consensus too about that, and it certainly includes things like support for civil liberties and participation and volunteering and protesting and resisting power. And actually, we know how to teach these things. It's not mysterious. It's not a puzzle that we have yet to solve. We actually know how to do it. I'm going to mention some things that we can do in schools. Although, of course, schools are not the only institutions by any means for teaching young people to be citizens. Families, neighborhoods, churches, and other religious organizations, the news media, the political parties, cities, they all have a role, and there's research on all that. But schools matter, and they are particularly amenable to our decision as a people to invest in civic engagement. So let me just list a few of the things that we know work in schools, and then I'll get to my second point. The following things have been studied and have been found to work. First of all, just simply teaching American history, American government, makes a difference. Students who study that, as one of my colleagues says, if you teach them, they will learn. And it's true. But more specifically, in those classes, discussing current events in a moderated way, with a teacher moderating it, and with input, with sort of factual input in the form, especially of newspaper articles and other good media, has been found to have very powerful positive effects. So that's two things. Third thing, community service, and especially when it's tied to academic learning. Community service learning is the term. Quite common and uneven in quality, but at its best, transformative in turning young people into active citizens. Fourth, extracurricular activities. The whole arena of extracurricular activities in a high school or even in a middle school or elementary school matters because it mirrors civil society, and the choices that young people have and their opportunities for leadership are important. But we might especially focus on student governments and school news media as two pieces of a school civil society that have been found to be very important. Fifth is appropriate levels of student voice and responsibility in the school. Nobody's advocating turning the school over to the kids, although there's some few interesting experiments, but they're not going very far. But what I'm talking about is whether students feel that when an important issue comes up within the school, that students have some responsible voice. And when they say that they do, there are much better results for their civic development. And finally, simulations. Simulation sounds kind of contemporary and sophisticated, and indeed some of the simulations that are available now are computer-based. But the traditional ones were Model UN, mock trial, and debate, and they are very powerful. So that's my first point. We know how to do this stuff. We can do it. The second point, though, is that we are offering all of those opportunities in an extremely unequal way. Extremely unequal. And it's deeply troubling to me because of all the subjects that we should teach in an equal way, certainly preparation for democracy with its system of one person, one vote, and equal rights in the courthouse and so on. Civics should be the most equitable, and yet it's terribly unequal. To put it a little bit exaggeratedly, but with a lot of truth, I'll just say, if you go to a high school where a lot of the kids are going to selective colleges, you're probably going to have that whole array of opportunities that I just mentioned available to you. Most of the students are going to be participating in at least some of them, and they're going to be doing pretty well on all kinds of measures of civic engagement. If you go to a school with a mixed academic record, you're going to find that those most successful students, the 20% or the 30% or the 40% who are heading to selective colleges, are getting all those opportunities, and the rest of the school is almost completely untouched by them. Not only not on the school newspaper, but also not covered in the school newspaper, not reading the school newspaper. And if you go to our many schools where the dropout rate is high, because after all, the dropout rate in the United States is about 1 in 3 for high school. So you go to one of our many schools where the dropout rate is high, you're going to find virtually none of those opportunities offered, or offered only in the most cursory way. So, for example, sometimes you will find a student government, but it will have almost no power or budget or authority. So the disparities in the inputs are very grave, and the disparities in the outcomes are not surprisingly serious, too. So I appreciate President Shalala mentioning the voter turnout, which is what I get paid to study. And it was exciting to see these increases in turnout, but when you talk about young people as a group, you forget about the differences. So in the primaries this time, about 1 in 4 college students and young people with any college experience at all, about 1 in 4 of that group voted. Not so great. I mean, we'd probably like everyone to vote, but historically it's a good showing, and it was the primary, and the turnout will be much higher in the general. But for those with no college experience, young adults with no college experience, about 1 in 14 voted, virtually none. And that's not some marginal group that we are almost forgetting about, but they're just on the edge of our consciousness. No, that's half the population. So half the population's not going to college or university, including community college, in their early years. And they're basically left out of the political system. So my 2 points are, it works, but we don't offer it equally, and I'd like to leave us with that. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. You gave us a lot to think about. It's time now for questions, but I want to kick off with one question to Dr. Shalala, and maybe the others of you would like to jump into this as well. Donna, you identified all of the traditional liberties and values in speech, religion, assembly, press, petition, and by mentioning slavery and women equality. But one of the things that's really interesting in your presentation is the emphasis on the young people. And you mentioned specifically in that context their concerns about education, healthcare, and global warming. And I'm wondering whether, bless you, I'm wondering whether you see a switch in the values that young people hold, as when you talk about healthcare, or when you talk about education. Is there now an assumption that I, as a young person, am owed something by my country? The provision of a system of health care, the provision of a system of education. And similarly, when you talk about global warming, I, as a young person, do I have a right to expect my government to help create a healthful environment for me? And do those become primary values?
You know, our samples have not been large enough in the polling on healthcare, for example, to tell you, we haven't picked up enough young people, for instance, of the college age, to tell you what their views are. I did have Molly Brody, who does the major polling for the Kaiser Family Foundation and the Washington Post, take a look at Do My Class compared to her national poll in the same sample time. And the students, number one, were much more conservative than the public was about their expectations about government providing these kinds of things. For instance, on Social Security, most of my class and most young people in this country do not believe that Social Security is going to be there for them. So they don't have the hang-ups. If you look at them in polls today, the economy dominates their interest, but they're not looking at the economy in terms of whether they're going to be able to provide tuition for their kids or be able to pay for their house. They're looking at the economy and whether they're going to be able to get a job. So it's pretty specific when they say the economy. All the other issues are, except for the environment, are very deep on the list. They're not even in double digits when you poll young people. So do they think health care is a right? Some of them do, but they're not into that kind of language. What they are into is, am I going to be able to get a job? And I think for this generation in particular, in thinking about equity and how we distribute wealth and some of those issues, but very much into the environment as well. But that's my read from the polls and from my own students, but both of you may have a different take on.
I was actually going to mention some of the same things about Social Security. I mean, obviously the generation has lots of diverse points of view, and they range from libertarians to socialists and everywhere in between. But I think there are, compared to previous generations, much lower expectations for what they are going to be given by the preceding generations. A general feeling that it's been pretty badly messed up and a very low regard for large public institutions. So I don't think, I mean, you're talking about a generation which expects to be coddled in any way by its predecessors. Quite the contrary. So what's very appealing to me is that things like the volunteering rate are at their all-time high. So you have a generation which seems to be willing to solve some problems itself, but doesn't expect to have those problems solved by anybody older than them.
It's a different group. Moses, were you? I was interested. You quoted John Kennedy. You weren't born then, right?
I was born in 1961. So.
You weren't around listening to that speech the way the rest of us were.
I think I heard him, if I recall.
The other thing I want to say about Social Security is I make the argument to my students that it's not about senior citizens, that it's a middle-income, middle-class subsidy, that their families would not be able to send them to school if Social Security and Medicare didn't exist. Mm-hmm. That, in fact, what we're doing, and that Lyndon Johnson actually understood that. He had this interesting exchange with Max Frankel, who was then a young reporter for the Times, when after he signed the bill, Max said, "Thank you." For my mother, and he said, no, you should thank me for yourself. And he didn't mean that Max would eventually get on Social Security and Medicare, which he is on now, but what he meant was this was a subsidy for him at his age, because he then didn't have to change his income mix to take care of his mother and his elderly relatives. So Johnson understood the politics and understood how the third rail was going to be sustained, and it really wasn't seniors that were going to do it. It was really going to be the middle class, middle-aged.
I'm sorry. One comment I'd like to make is whether or not technological changes have changed our culture. When you look at the generations today, the new technologies are very much part of their lives, from cell phones to iPods, very easy access to information. Things come pretty fast. And then you look at previous generations. There's this generation divide. That's something that's very important to me. That's what I talked about. And because I think that it exemplifies an important concern, which is that whether or not the younger generations of today appreciate the kind of arduous work it has taken to hold this country together, to create the opportunities that we have today, and that it does not appear that they have been part of great wars and the great movements that shape society. So it's easy to take a lot of things that we have for granted. There's always a presumption that we will never turn the clock back. I don't accept that. I mean, if you look at how we responded after 9/11, people were willing to get rid of the Bill of Rights, take away freedom of speech, and fear reign. And it could easily happen again in the future. So as society is changing and things are becoming more global, the concern is whether or not that creates more threats to our democracy, makes democracy more fragile. And I would just be interested in whether or not you are sensing that in the academy and in the schools with the students.
I think I would separate out what we adults did to screw up the Constitution as a result of 9/11 and then the kids' reaction. The kids, what it did for the young people is it made them unsure about their future. It scared the bejesus out of them in a different way. They had always thought of themselves as being safe in their own country, and it frightened them about their future and made them more uncertain, but it didn't turn them against the Constitution. In fact, it turned us into that kind of seeing it as that kind of threat. But for them, it unsettled them in a way I've never seen. But of course, I didn't live through the World War II generation, so but it totally unsettled them about being sure about their security. On college campuses, you saw people going to school closer to home as opposed to going away to school. So you saw a little of that, and a lot more people that wanted to move on to campuses, to live on campus as opposed to off campus. So you saw it in simple ways, but I can tell it. I could tell it. I was there on campus on 9/11, and they have never. That generation has never recovered from that unsettledness. That's my read. What's yours, Bill?
Well, I generally have a benign, optimistic attitude towards this generation, at least relative to the immediate previous generations. And I say that as a civil libertarian. So one of the reasons is I think they have pretty dyed-in-the-wool civil libertarian instincts compared to predecessors. There's one thing I want to throw out there that worries me, though, which is that they have very, very skeptical and alienated attitudes towards the press, which is a whole separate topic, and part of that discussion, if we were going to have it, would have to be about whether the press has brought that upon itself. And there's two sides to that debate, obviously. But I do worry about sort of commitment to the First Amendment when it comes to the press. And I say that not just anecdotally, but based on studies like this huge Knight Foundation First Amendment survey, which found young people very tolerant of all kinds of free speech and dissent and minority viewpoints and minority lifestyles, but not at all interested in sticking up for the press, which I don't think they regard as in any way an ally.
No, their idea of news is Jon Stewart, and I mean, I require my students to read the newspaper, and it's like it's a foreign document to them. I mean, they like it once they get into it, but it's not something they do other than reading the sports pages. I actually go, when I visit college campuses, I go into the residence halls, dining areas to see what the students are doing, and most universities give out newspapers. You can pick up a newspaper wherever your eateries are, but they don't read the front page, and they certainly don't read the editorial page. I'm always amused when the people on the campuses I've run get so uptight about the editorials when, there are 10 people that read them. Most of them are donors, of course, but or they don't know the difference between whether someone's read a news story or not. But they're very, and it's not that they're informed. They just get it from different information. A lot of it from YouTube. If I want to communicate with my students, I'll put it on the things that they read, as opposed to expecting them to read the mainstream media.
Okay, let's open this up a little bit. When you're recognized, will you please wait for the microphone to come to you, and then will you identify yourself? All right, let's start over here.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'm Mike Usdan with the Institute for Educational Leadership and a longtime admirer and friend of Donna Shalala.
Indeed.
So it's a great privilege to be here. I might say for the record that I was born in 1961, and I do remember Mr. Kennedy's speech on that snow-filled day. Let me ask a question to Donna specifically, and then perhaps to the other members of the panel. And it's the mixed blessing of American exceptionalism in the global environment we're in. It seems to me that in some ways American exceptionalism has gotten us into some of this trouble. The sanctimony about the country, our country right or wrong, that kind of attitude that you certainly see on the campaign trail at the current time. And whether in a world that's increasingly skeptical of the United States, hopefully that can be redressed a bit in the years ahead, It seems to me our arrogance and sanctimony has gotten us into a lot of trouble, and without in any way disagreeing with any of the presentations about the wonderful history and tradition and ideals of the United States and our history. How do we balance this American exceptionalism and pride and so forth with the arrogance with which we're viewed as kind of a sanctimonious nation that wants to transpose its will and its principles, as wonderful as they may be, on a world that's less impressed with us than we may be with ourselves? That's kind of a very convoluted question, but I'd like to get it out there.
Oh, it's a good question. You're talking about the fine line between hubris and generosity, and I think that we expect our leaders to be able to think that through, and sometimes they go over that line in which it's seen as arrogance. And the other thing is the rest of the world got better educated, many of them educated here, so they don't put up with American arrogance as they would have during a certain period, but they still admire Americans. Even when you go to Iran, a country that I was a Peace Corps volunteer in, they talk about Americans differently than they talk about our government. They really do. They get the Americans part. They admire the people and the country itself. They distinguish between that and our leaders. Moses, you've hung around on Capitol Hill.
Yeah,
where the hubris is rampant.
Some say that. Well, I guess my take on this is that I believe America is exceptional, and I definitely have an attitude about it. But I think that you have to qualify it. We are exceptional because we're different. We have a different history. And we've achieved a lot in a very short time period. But I think it's important to separate America from politics. Just because someone wins an election and has a particular policy point of view doesn't necessarily mean that that is what America all is. We may disagree with a liberal administration, a conservative leaning administration, but the goal here internally is to challenge that administration to make sure that it meets what we Americans believe America is supposed to be and what makes us exceptional. And so I think this goes to a point where some non-Americans like America and like Americans, but they may not like all our policies. That said, the world is not full of angels either. And so we have every right to critique where we think they're wrong. But I think it's important to separate what sometimes is politics from what we know is America.
Do you want to comment?
Well, maybe I'll just continue to be the data geek and the sort of specialist and say another piece of this is that American kids don't learn much about the rest of the world. So actually on the best comparative studies of how our kids do in terms of civic knowledge, they do quite well on fundamental principles that are embodied in the American Constitution. So freedom of speech and things like that, they understand better than other countries. They do extremely badly on factual knowledge about the international system. So European kids actually know who's on the Security Council. We're on the Security Council, but our kids don't know that at all. So the problem is there is only a limited number of hours in the school day, and I myself wrestle a little bit with whether they should be learning local issues, which are mostly left out of the curriculum, the national constitution, which is in the curriculum, but which they don't know as well as we'd like, international issues. I mean, it's hard. But I think a little piece of the arrogance is that Americans really, have no idea, for example, how a parliamentary system works. And so one might have an interesting conversation about whether our system, the pros and cons of ours versus the rest of the world, but American young people don't have any idea how to make that comparison.
Just a word about what it is that the rest of the world gets from us, kind of to add to the things that have already been said. Much of the world knows about the United States not only through our foreign policy, but through television and movies. And what they get through American television and movies are not at all the values that we're talking about here. And that, in some places, is extraordinarily off-putting. I lecture a lot in the Middle East and North Africa, and I hear that constantly when I'm there. You know, all you people in the United States care about is sex and war. Well, if I knew nothing but American foreign policy, and nobody knows about American foreign aid, of course, but American foreign policy and American television movies, I might well share that opinion. So there is that factor as well. Okay, more questions. Susan, let's start with Don, please, and then we'll come down towards...
Yes, I'm Don Wolfensberger with the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center. I just had, I want to commend you all on your comments. I say amen. I second everything you said. I think it's you all had wonderful presentations. I had two reactions. One, I talked a few weeks ago to a young educator from St. Petersburg who is also involved in a conference aimed at young people where they are bringing together young people to talk more about civic responsibilities. Keep in mind, the Russian people went from a monarchy to communism, and now with democracy, they think, well, we've got all these rights, we've got the right to pursue material prosperity, and yet they don't think at all about responsibilities. And I think, a lot of you are aiming to perhaps re-educate our own young people because they're not born with this gene necessarily, but the idea of community service and so on. I just think we have a leg up there, and I commended her on at least getting a start there with teaching something about civic engagement and responsibility. The other thing is sort of a flip side of Flip's question and her comment to Donna Shalala's remarks, and that is I was reminded, you talk about the dangers of big government during times of a crisis such as we have, dangers to civil liberties, but I'm reminded of a quote that's attributed at least to Ben Franklin, is the more people turn over all of their security to the government, the more they give up all of their liberty, or something to that effect. I'm just wondering whether there is this danger also to the extent that we turn over other responsibilities to the government. Are we sacrificing our own individual freedoms and liberties? And thinking here, part of American exceptionalism is we've turned down socialism, and yet you go across the street, the Treasury Department, you wonder what's going on there. But but also we are building a bigger and bigger social welfare state. Is there a danger to the values of individual liberties in turning too much to the government for those securities as well?
I think there's always a danger to individual liberties. And I don't care what time period we're in, because we're human beings and driven by emotions. And I think that's why, in continuing to quote of Ben Franklin, when he was asked after the Constitutional Convention, do we have a monarchy or a republic? He said a republic if you can keep it, meaning if you can nurture it and sustain it. So I think that we have to presume that whatever rights and freedoms we have can always be taken away here in America. There are articles run on the front pages of the Washington Post, New York Times, whether or not we're at the end of American capitalism. That's a dangerous question in and of itself, because that presupposes certain liberties that could be eliminated. I just think that we can't presume that, okay, we achieved a level of greatness, thanks for the sacrifices of those in the past, so now we can just go out and party and enjoy all the technological advances we have today, and when they're not there, we can cry about it. Have we become a spoiled child nation? And maybe that's true, but I think we have to address that and just presume that whatever we have is tenuous and fragile, which means that we always have to work to keep it. We always have to be engaged. We're all tied to history. We're all tied to slavery. We're all tied to rights, all the rights movements. And I think as long as we approach it with that mindset, it will inspire all of us to do whatever we can to be vigilant about our rights and the state of our country.
In many ways, it's the other side of Mike's question that, there's this balance, and I absolutely agree with Moses that we have to keep working at it. We do not want government to take over every institution in our society, because if they pay for it, they're going to regulate it in a way that that they think is appropriate. So we always want to find the balance. And that's why the whole point is, if you want this extraordinary American experience, you have to work at it all the time and constantly work on the balance.
I want to follow that up with a question that I thought of earlier. You were talking about this generation, the younger generation, expecting much less from the government. And then
Much less Social Security, at least.
Well, Social Security. Okay, that's part of my question. Does that translate altogether into expecting less from the government generally? And if so, how is that going to affect the level of civic participation by the younger generation?
I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that the economic crisis we're in reinforces their view that government is going to have less to do. They can expect less from government. That certainly reinforces that view. Does it mean that they won't vote? I don't think we know that. I don't think we know.
Yeah,
that.
I mean, at the moment, I would say there's a divergence between their. If you imagine that those two things would correlate, the willingness to participate in the political system and expectations of how well it'll deliver for you, those two things are diverging pretty strikingly. The decline in expectations for government seems to me part of a much bigger story, which is that in all the developed countries, young people's there's a generational decline in confidence in all major institutions. I mean, that's a simplification, but generally speaking, that's true. So in the 50s, people had a lot more confidence, not only in the government, but also in the mass media, the military, the police, the big business, unions. And when you follow those over the generations in both Europe and the United States and Canada and East Asia, you see substantial decline. So that's part of the reality of the 21st century.
No, it's not so sure that it's by ideology either in terms of the role of government.
Right.
I worked early in my career, for two cabinet secretaries. Some people will remember them. Patricia Roberts Harris, who was followed by Moon Landrieu at HUD in the Carter administration. Pat Harris, they were both liberal Democrats. Pat Harris, though, was a civil rights lawyer, and she didn't trust the states or local governments, and she saw the world from the point of view of Washington and her experience in the civil rights era, and believed in a very strong role for the federal government. Moon Landrieu arrives, and he had been a mayor, and his question was constantly, is this an appropriate role for the federal government? Both of them were liberal Democrats, and both of them had completely different views of federalism and the role of government. And so I'm not so sure where we end up, and we shouldn't assume that this is a Democrat or a Republican kind of discussion, because it really depends on the leaders, where they sit, and what their experience has been.
Okay, can we have the microphone up in the front? I don't want to have the people in the front think that they're being ignored. Right here on your, thank you, and then we'll go to the gentleman on the other side.
Thank you. I just wanted to
Maury, will you identify yourself?
Maury Waters, retired professor of international law and politics. I just wanted to comment with regard to the observations that several of you have made, including Donna Shalala's last one. That is, I think, without wanting to be a Pollyanna, I think there is a political gene that operates within our society that continues to agitate against excesses. And I think it came out and revealed itself partly from religion against slavery right from the beginning, and eventually overturned it. The same thing happened again with regard to McCarthy and his excesses regarding communism. So I think there will always be that agitation, because some of us are agitators, and we will always object to that. But my question basically is, we're talking about the fact that a large number of our students are not paying attention to some of the things that we think they should be paying attention to, and a few others are. How do we distinguish, what are the reasons, what are the explanations for why some are and some are not? What are the distinguishing features in terms of the composition of that group?
Some of it is their own educational experience and what we're doing in the classroom. I got my PhD at the Maxwell School. They did this fabulous citizenship course that they taught to almost every undergraduate that really sort of set them up and gave them context, which I thought was a very intriguing way of not depending on a previous education as setting young people up. Some of it is just the compartmentalization of knowledge now, and the accreditation process. You go into engineering, it's very difficult to pull that kid out and give them some other subject. And some of it is just the fashion of the day in which we've downplayed American history and other kinds of things, and people have become more specialized. I just convinced a group of undergraduates, after looking at the data, that the best preparation for the law school admissions test, the LSAT, is a philosophy major. Because the data actually shows that if you major in philosophy, you score higher by 100 points on the LSATs. And some of it is just the way we've organized education, where it's increasingly professionalized, focused on the first job. I used to tell parents at Wisconsin, we're not preparing them for their first job. The test of our education is whether they can handle their third and fourth and fifth job, and whether we've given them context for learning new subjects. So, we're just not as focused with that movement of citizenship. There is a movement of public service, but whether we set it up properly so it's in the context of citizenship, I just can't answer that question right now. I can tell you that educators are concerned enough about it, that they're doing a wide variety of things to try to address it.
What about just the question of access to that education, the availability?
Well, we've gotten into this testing mode. Mike Houston might have a better answer. We've gotten into this testing mode in which we want to test the fundamentals, and we're squeezing out some other things that we think are pretty fundamental. Diane Ravitch has written extensively about American history and our failure to properly teach the kind of fundamentals of American democracy. But when we teach the test, when we get into this testing mode in which we don't understand the need for a broad education and context for whatever's going to come next, we get into this.
Well, I mean, my obsession is inequality in the provision of civic opportunities by basically social class. And the thing I'd like to add to my earlier point about that is that the rest of the scaffolding that might have existed for working class young people to develop into citizenship has been shattered. So we need schools more than ever because schooling promotes active citizenship. We know that from years and years of research. But other things did too, like union membership and growing up in a tight, cohesive community where people were politically engaged and grassroots parties, and all those things are shattered. At this point, you're actually more likely to be in a union if you have a 4-year college degree than if you only have a high school degree and you're young. So everything is working to broaden these gaps, which are very pronounced, so that, for example, in the 1970s, it was still quite likely that if you had only a high school diploma, that you would answer the question, do you go to community meetings affirmatively? At this point, it's down to, I think, 11% saying yes. So basically, our meetings don't have people without college degrees in them. They're dominated by people with college degrees. Now, we start with that problem, which is profound and has to do with changes in the social structure, and then we tell schools you must focus on reading and math for everybody, and if anybody's at risk of possibly failing, remembering that a third of them aren't going to complete high school, so a lot of people are at risk, then you better focus completely and narrowly on that and forget about anything else, and we just exacerbate the problem. So, I mean, I'm at a college, in a private university, in a college of citizenship, which is very much like the Maxwell School model, and our kids are going to be totally fine in this department. But there are lots of people who are on a totally different track.
Maury, do you want to just hand and then we'll go to the gentleman back.
My name is Robert Mitchell. I'm a retired teacher and author of Nurturing the Souls of Our Children, Education and the Culture of Democracy. John Dewey said that democracy has to be reborn with each generation, and the schools are his midwife. That's been the subject, basically, of what we've been talking about, and what Dr. Strum mentioned initially about bringing this into the K through 12 educational system. My feeling is that No Child Left Behind, in the way it's written, has undermined this idea of a civic education and the possibilities of bringing a lot of what we've been talking about here to light in the K through 12 educational system. And I wonder if you would comment further on that. Dr. Shalala and Dr. Levine both addressed that a little bit in the last comment, but maybe you could speak a little bit more about the relationship between No Child Left Behind and how it's undermining this idea of civic education. There's an organization called the Forum for Education and Democracy, which has advocated a lot of changes to No Child Left Behind, and there are some good ideas in No Child Left Behind, and bringing about equality and opportunity, equality of opportunity in this country. But I think that it's undermining some of the ideas about democracy, and I wonder if you'd just address that a little bit more.
You want to add anything to what you said?
I know I think it's neutral. I think that we had a problem before we got No Child Left Behind, to be honest. I'm no great fan of that piece of legislation because it wasn't properly funded to do some of what I thought were pretty good goals. But we had a serious problem before No Child Left Behind, in part because of the accountability movement, but in large part because of the way in which we've allocated resources. If anyone was doing civic education, some states were taking some responsibility, and it's uneven across the states. But No Child Left Behind was not organized to specifically address that. It was not properly funded, even for the parts that might have helped. But I think our schools were in trouble long before that. And using public schools in particular for this function, we need to rethink it again. They played a role in earlier times, and because of the kind of financial pressures we put them under, they're playing less of a role as far as I can tell. And the universities are trying to pick it up.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I mean, actually, the journey I'm on is that everyone in my world hates No Child Left Behind, in part because it doesn't say anything affirmatively about citizenship, and then there's a general view that it's squeezing it out. And in fact, it's not just random. I mean, this Gallup had a poll where they asked parents, do you think that there's less attention to citizenship because of No Child Left Behind? And I think 2/3 said yes. But we got a Ford grant to study this and everything, and we looked carefully, and we really couldn't identify. In fact, we had a null result. No Child Left Behind did not seem to be affecting the curriculum in regard to citizenship. And I think Dr. Shalala, your explanation is the right one, which is we have a deeper and older problem than this. So that also means that amending No Child Left Behind wouldn't solve the problem. What I do think it represents, though, is an attitude towards education in which the leverage that we have, especially from the federal government down, has always got to be about measuring outputs, which is understandable. The reason is a lot of distrust that if you offer opportunities, they'll be done very well. So the thought is you must measure outcomes, because if you offer opportunities, they won't be delivered very well, which I understand, and there's some truth to that. Problem is, it's very hard to measure a lot of the outcomes that we're talking about here in a standard way. I mean, you could, of course, survey kids about whether they support the First Amendment, but very troubling to me ethically to say that a school must generate positive responses to that question. It's an opinion question.
Education is still a local function.
True.
No matter how much money we pour into it, it's not a federal function. And it's at the wrong, thinking it through at that level, it still is very much a local and state activity.
And there's no question there's room to do civic education within the structure of No Child Left Behind. I mean, just one example of that is that No Child Left Behind has nothing to say about high school curriculum. And there's no mandatory tests under NCLB, so you can do whatever you want in high school in terms of, I mean, there are requirements about things like graduation rates, but curriculum isn't affected. So there's no reason that states and localities can't actually ramp up civic education.
In his wonderful book, volumes actually, The History of American Education, Lawrence Kremen, the great historian of American education, wrote something that I actually once did something about, but he said that the way in which we raised the standards for schools in this country in the 19th century was the universities that parents wanted their high schools, the kids, to have access to, simply raised their standards. And when I was at Wisconsin, we were trying to improve the preparation of students that came to us from Wisconsin, and the governor, who was Tommy Thompson at the time, was totally frustrated. He could not get it done. So I told him that we would get it done, and I went to the faculty and said, if we raise our admission standards, give the school system in Wisconsin 7 years to have 4 years of English, 3 years of history, 3 years of math. I think we had 4 years of languages. We could actually transform the schools by backing back into it, because the fact is everyone wants to send their kid to Madison, really, but they ended up someplace else, and that would actually improve the quality of the schools, and in fact it happened. So that universities have a role here, particularly the great public universities. And I actually got the idea from Larry Kremen's book, which talked about how you could actually revolutionize the the schools. And I've always thought the governors were kind of dumb. They were pouring all this money in when what they really ought to do is raise the admission standards for their public institutions, including community colleges, and then give the schools enough time and the resources to sort of back down into it. Mike, did you ever hear of that as a strategy?
Yeah. Oh, unfortunately, you're about the only one who's employed it.
Yeah, well, I had a good governor to work with.
Okay, there are a couple of people, the gentleman sitting all the way in the back and then the gentleman sitting in the corner. How about we take 2 questions at a time, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond.
My name is Mark Materno. I'm a fellow for the Interactivity Foundation. We're an organization that tries to engage citizens in the exploration and development of conceptual possibilities for public policy in different areas of concern. And I actually am, or was, a philosophy major and actually did my doctorate in philosophy. And I was struck while you were talking, Ms. Shalala, about how students that you observe are interested more in jobs than anything else. And I was also struck by your discussion about the values behind American democracy, especially things like free speech, criticism, dissent. And one of the things that I've been wondering about is whether the values and habits of mind that we need to inculcate to become good employees or successful employees are at odds with the values and habits of mind that we may need to inculcate to become good democratic citizens. I remember I spent about 5 years in Europe, former Soviet Union, working for George Soros' organization promoting open society. And I remember people there were interested in democracy mostly because they thought that they were going to get the material possessions that we have. I also remember writing home to a former student of mine and being shocked when she said that, oh, open society, everybody here is afraid to say what we really think because we'll lose our jobs. And so I'm wondering whether there's a conflict there, and if there's a conflict there, how we might go about addressing it.
You know, when I
Hold on,
said...
let's just get the one other question.
Okay,
and we'll
good.
answer them together.
Thanks. My name is Or Stuhl. I'm with wilsoncenter.org. So both a member of your young person demographic and of the new media. Peter, I was wondering, thank you for bringing a lot of sort of hard data to our discussion today. And I was wondering if you had offhand any stats on media readership, because while certainly the newspaper industry is not quite healthy and subscriptions are down, I wasn't under the impression that eyeballs are certainly a different story. And for Donna, you gave a great speech on kind of celebrating how much more politically involved young people are for this election season. But then a little bit later, I was wondering how you reconciled that with your claim that young people also don't read the front page of newspapers and kind of the equation of new media with the Comedy Central TV shows and then with YouTube, which I think are a little bit different animals. So just a little comment on that. Thank you.
When I said they don't read newspapers, I don't mean that they don't get the news. And that is that they're very much online, more likely to be online getting their information from a wide variety of sources. That includes YouTube and some of their favorite television, what they describe as television news shows. So it doesn't mean that they're ill-informed, but just that they're not reading newspapers. I happen to be on the board of Gannett. Newspaper readership is down. Internet use is up. It means, and of course we've now combined television and newspapers in a way making them in some ways more efficient or from my point of view, more interesting. So there are some things going on. I think the real move for the young people are really to looking online for different pieces of information. They'll get it faster, but they certainly do get information that way. But that also leads into the first question, which when I suggested that they were concerned about their job, I wasn't suggesting it in a utilitarian fashion. In fact, if you look at the movements on campus, entrepreneurship is one of those movements. If you go to my student placement center, one of the offices, which is a very nice office as a matter of fact, is for young people that want to start their own businesses. And in fact, they're starting their own businesses as they have for generations on campus and long before. So just because they're worried about the job doesn't mean that they don't want to go into science and create new knowledge, that they don't want to go to a place that's more creative. They're not necessarily moving away from that or necessarily compromising on that. They're wondering whether that world of discovery, of starting your own business, of getting your PhD and creating new scientific knowledge is going to be available to them. But they're not taking the first job out there necessarily. They may be going into an internship. So I don't see where the value pieces are changing for them just because they're worried in general about the economy and whether they're going to be there, those kinds of opportunities. They asked me questions like, I was just at the University of Michigan, are fellowships going to be available for graduate school? What happens in a terrible economy, of course, is people go back to school, that our enrollments all go up because people go back to get better credentials. But I don't see them, becoming more narrowly focused. We've got a lot of people in universities around the country in all sorts of different kinds of places. Some of them are getting trained for a very specific job, and some of them are more broadly educated because they're going to enter professions where they're going to create knowledge and jobs and a future. Is that?
Well, actually, what I'm asking is, there's something. People say it all the time. I mean, basically, to be a good employee, what you need to learn how to do is to keep your mouth shut and not think very critically, and keep your nose clean. And
not at the places that are growing jobs in this country.
Perhaps, but I mean, a lot of our students, I think, do learn something about that. And I think, indeed, I was very amazed. I was a philosophy major, but I'm amazed at how savvy these kids seem to be about. I mean, people say that we don't learn to think critically now. We learn to, or what it means to think critically is learn to which authorities we ought to defer to. And this is a very different attitude of mind, or a very different habit of thinking than I would associate with the habits that led to, let's say, the development of the American Revolution. I was just watching.
I just disagree. I mean, I see these young people. It's not, the formal challenging of authority. There is a certain amount of professionalism that's expected when you're a graduate student, or when you're going out to start a business, since you're going to go ask the banker for some money for an investment or some venture capitalist. But I really see the generation as more entrepreneurial, more interested in creating new opportunities, less interested in going to conventional business. But there's still a generation that wants to go to Wall Street. They want to be masters of the universe. Being masters of the universe is not exactly towing the line. It's a wide and woolly world out there on Wall Street. So it's a very interesting generation. Much more comfortable with themselves and with each other, much more gender-free, I think, from my point of view, and much more entrepreneurial, much more interested in not working for anyone but starting their own stuff. The fact that you can have these entrepreneurial centers in the old-fashioned placement centers, the placement centers aren't the same. The placement centers are computer centers where you get on Career Builder and go look for a job. No one looks at classifieds anymore.
All right, we've got time for more questions. I'm very struck by the fact that, excuse me, we haven't had a question from a woman in the audience yet. Has anybody else noticed that? Aha, there go the hands.
Flip.
I'm a young and a woman.
Hi, my name is Anna Scott. I'm with the American Society for Public Administration. I'm just curious because I'm hearing a lot of discussion that seems to boil down to this collectivist thought versus this individualistic thought. And it's always been my understanding that the American national identity is a very individual identity. We individually attend to our collective culture. So I just have to wonder what you see the role of the collective American identity versus the individual identity in participating within our government system?
Moses, that's yours.
That's true.
I think the issue of American identity is the outstanding question. I mean, what is our identity? What makes America? It relates to a question that arose earlier. That is how the world sees us, and based on the opinion of many that America has done bad. The issue is what America are they talking about, and what makes America? As I said, I think you can't allow politics. You can't surrender America to politics, and that's important. But I think you have to parse that issue. There is a need for a common understanding of what it means to be America and what our mission is and what our goals are and what it's going to take to keep this country together, to maintain the position it is in the world today. We have to have that sort of common view on what is required to sustain our great country. And we all have to be committed to at least doing it. Now, we may have different views on what it takes to get there, but we have to have some point of destination for America. And to me, that then becomes the place where we have a national identity, a common understanding. But implicit in that is a value system that cherishes individual thought and dissent and different cultures that make up America. We just don't exist to exist. We're not going to, we're not just going to be great just because we're Americans. We're in a highly competitive world now, and we could falter. So I think that understanding what it's going to take for us to survive in the future is where the common understanding in the reference point has to be, but appreciating that one of the goals that we're fighting for and maintaining what we call America is the ability to be free as individuals.
Okay, more questions, and it doesn't have to be from a woman this time. There's a gentleman sitting over at the table here, and then is there a hand on the side as well? Okay, then we'll go to you next.
Good morning. My name is Bob Ponectera. I'm the executive director of Liberty's Promise, which is an organization that works with low-income immigrant youth, teaching them civic engagement. So before I ask my question, that was perfect timing because I want to follow on with what Ms. Scott asked and Mr. Boyd's comments. The good news is, you know, I think there's some positive things to be said about working with immigrant youth and teaching them civic engagement. You know, the bad news is we have young people living in our community that don't know there's a place you can go in the community where they'll give you a book and you can leave with a book, and if you come back with a book, they'll give you more books, and then you can go back and forth like that. They have no idea this exists. We have people living in the community that fear the police, and I'm not talking about undocumented immigrants. I'm talking about legally documented youth who fear that the police are going to, you know, ask them for their identity papers on the bus. If they don't have it, they'll be deported. The police are there to beat them up and ask them for money and then beat them up. This is in our community. So you know, the good news is, however, is that it's not hard. And what I mean to say by that, it's not hard to teach youth about what this community is all about and the things that exist in the community and how people can actively participate and why they should participate and what benefit it is to them. You know, we have a 10-week program of civic engagement. At the end of that program, young people see themselves as being able to participate, to volunteer, to approach their elected representative and so on and so forth. And just to take Dr. Levine's comments a little further, if you teach them, they'll learn it. They want to learn it. They want to learn it. They want to learn about the community. They want to fit in. They want to be a part of the broader politic, and they want to be here. So that's good news, I think, that young people still want to be involved if they have the opportunity. I would, however, like to hear on it's something that's been puzzling me, or something I've been thinking about. I'd love to hear the panel's take on actually what Ms. Scott asked, is this sort of dichotomy between the individual and the broader community. So it's not the individual and the government, it's the individual and it's me as a part of the republic and everybody else in this room as part of the republic. And, if I'm too busy to answer your email because I'm very busy, or if I'm, cutting you off in traffic because I have someplace very important to go and, well, you don't. Because if you did, you'd be, moving up on the bumper of the car in front of you. So how does that sort of behavior that seems to me anyway to be epidemic, how does that sort of behavior relate to some of the phrases that Mr. Boyd was throwing out, like this common understanding and this reference point, and something we never hear anymore, the public good? Mm-hmm. Where does that come from? I mean, how do we reconcile those two behaviors?
It's part of the Civic. I love your program, by the way. When you were talking about traffic, I was reminded Dave Barry, who's very funny, and lives in Miami, once said that Miami drivers drive according to the rules of the country they came from.
The same in Washington.
Yeah. About once every 3 months, I speak to the new citizens. We swear them in, and I give the little speech, and the immigration people are very nice. And I have to give 3 speeches because there are 15,000 people in actually every month in Miami who are sworn in. And the most recent one was very interesting to me because I did talk about libraries, and I did talk about the common good. And I told the story about Dave Barry, which I think they got because they all laughed. There were about 5,000 people in the room. And I explained that while they had been in the United States for a period of time, there were some things that linked all of us. And I told them that some things were free and some things that they actually had to pay for. And there were other things that they just got because they were living in the country and they should have learned them before, but I wanted to talk to them about it. I actually did talk about library books, and that I hope that they heavily used the libraries because they were free. And I asked whether any of them had come from a country in which they get books free, and none of them had at the time. But I talked about traffic. I talked about voting. I talked about obeying the rules and what it meant to live in a country in which we had all agreed about the rules, not the laws, the rules about how we would all behave. And afterwards, I gave them all my email. I got thousands of emails from people saying that they appreciated the fact that I had given them some principles. They all took notes when I gave my little lecture. They were all borrowing pencils from each other, and they took notes. And every once in a while, they follow up, and tell me that they found a new rule that made them an even better American. So I appreciate your comments. We teach those rules, but you sort of get it by osmosis when you're an immigrant, sometimes because you fall flat on your face or get arrested or something, which is even more dangerous. I think that we have to do more of that in terms of an orientation. The kind of test we give for citizenship is really sort of silly. It doesn't have a lot to do with the kind of collective what we all have to do to maintain this democracy, because it's not done that way. It's a kind of options, factual kind of thing. So most citizens get it through osmosis. Young citizens, young immigrants need to get it through, I think, more formal orientations. We tend to mainstream them and assume that they get it. I have cousins who came a year ago from Cuba. The Lebanese went every place. Yeah. So my great-grandfather, who came here in 1890, his first cousins went to Cuba, and they won the visa lottery. And they show up, of course, at my doorstep. They're Shalalas. They're actually Shalalas. Watching them figure out what it means to be an American has been amazing. From trying to figure out our crazy healthcare system when they got jobs, they had to make choices between plans, to figuring out what the basic rules are and the kind of cooperative rules, which are very different than Cuba's rules, has been amazing for me. So I've gotten a whole education in exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about. They actually, when they took intensive English, they got those rules because part of the integration in the public intensive English courses were, in fact, some of that, particularly for the young people that they brought with them.
I think there are several issues going on there that you highlighted. One is how do you motivate kids to get to the library? How do you motivate the parents in those communities to make use of the facilities? Obviously, there's a disconnect between the importance of the facility and their everyday lives. And that's a vacuum there that has to be filled. But I think what it also says is that there's a vacuum of ideas and activism in our country when those kinds of things exist. I mean, you mentioned entrepreneurship. If I were an entrepreneur, I'd be figuring out how I could make money to get them to the library. Can I get the government to pay to take them there? And so that when you have this kind of entrepreneur activity, you have ideas churning as to how we can solve these problems. It's not just one way. We can talk about until the end of the world what the problem is, why it's critical for more people to become engaged, but the scholars can give you all the, as you all can, all the social explanations of human behavior and social behavior. But the bottom line is, as one who lives in the suburbs, why is it important to me that they go to the library? Well, why is that of any concern to me? Where I can think of a number of reasons why it's important to me. It's important that we have continuous discourse in the mediums that connect to all of us as to why that's important, and the mediums that they listen to. They probably are accessing mediums that never suggest there's a value in the use of those books. So there is a culture, there's a lifestyle. And so when we're talking about this whole issue of identity, we need to talk about our culture. And not only how do we promote a constitution of rights and freedoms, but a whole culture of rights and freedoms. So it's a cultural issue, it's a social issue, but there are many avenues to addressing it, and I think that our goal here is to make sure that we give support to all of them. And as I said, even from an entrepreneurial perspective, there's a way, I think, to address those issues.
All right, let's have there are two people against the wall, and let's have those two questions together, and we'll see whether we have time for more after that, okay?
Hi, my name is Tara Krzeski. I'm a research intern here at the Wilson Center as well as a senior at the Penn State University. And coming from a public university where we have general education requirements kind of dictated to us, we have a choice for what we can take, but we have to take certain math and certain social studies. And I'm wondering, coming from a panel that has a lot of experience on college boards and teaching at universities, I was wondering if there's any possibility or if it would be possible to maybe change the curriculum at these public schools to make civics or an American government class a requirement, because coming from a young part of the voting population, a lot of my friends, I feel, have this sense of entitlement where the government will be here for them whether they participate or not. And I'm feeling like before studies like this become fruitful in our primary education system, there's going to continue to be this group of people that feels disconnected and unwilling to participate in the system. So to spoon feed it maybe to this group of people through public education, cities, I was wondering if this might be possible to change the education requirements.
You know,
we used to have those questions. Go ahead. From the woman next to her. And then
Hi, I'm Allison Broad. I'm an intern at the Sunlight Foundation. I'm wondering how civic participation is exactly defined, because I think that there are generational differences, huge ones based on when people were born in relation to technology. I mean, those who are my age, I mean, we go on, say, moveon.org and sign an online petition, and I don't think that my senators necessarily count those petitions as say that those petitions carry as much weight as, say, a handwritten petition. We might not protest, but we will speak on message boards. Should young people be taught civic participation so that it relates to their elders? Thank you.
I love those two questions. The first one is that we used to have American history requirements, and then there was great pressure to give students more choices so that you didn't put all your money into American historians at universities, particularly at a place like Penn State. Your freshman class must be 10,000 or something, about 10,000.
That's just at main campus, and there's not like...
Yes, right, exactly. So, the movement is for more flexibility, giving students more choices as opposed to less. But Penn State and every other university in this country used to have an American history requirement. They've just moved away from that. Those decisions are made by faculty under great pressure from administrations because the students are the consumers and they want more choices, and from the professional schools that don't want students limited just to one course as opposed to having choices. So I'm afraid we've moved away in that movement. On the second question, I'd just like to say we're just a generation away. There are all sorts of members of Congress who have young people in their offices that do in fact track the blogs and the chat rooms and the petitions. In universities, we take them seriously. And my class has its own blog and its own chat rooms when I teach. So we increasingly use the modern media. We're just a generation away from that being more mainstream. But let there be no question in your mind, unless they're in an absolutely safe seat and pay attention to no one and to no piece of paper, they've got young people in their office that are following these in their communities, that are monitoring them. They are not necessarily themselves online, but they certainly have people in their offices that are online.
Do you want to say something?
Well, I actually want to address the whole online question because there was also an earlier question about online news media that I didn't get to address. The only thing I'd say, there's lots of statistics and trends and everything. The one thing I'd say, though, is it's not all about age. Because, so there's this, my millennial era friends who are very heavy political users of the internet tend to say, we just go online nowadays, and you guys didn't, or you learned how, but we do it as natives. So there's the digital native metaphor. But really, that can be very misleading. The generation that literally is most likely to send an email with a political content is the retirees over 65. Emails, the earliest form, but the fact is, older people are more likely to be interested in politics to start with, and so when you have the interplay of politics and technology, older people actually beat younger people. Younger people, sure, are more likely to be the newest adopters of things like, especially now, social networking. But it spreads fast, and there's often not any political or social content to it. And the other thing is there's tremendous inequality. I'm becoming a monomaniac, but there's tremendous inequalities. In the 90s, we were worried about the digital divide and whether people were literally hooked up. Now, a lot of people are hooked up to the internet, and also with portable electronic devices. But you have to, in order to be involved with it for anything that could remotely be called civic or social or political, you have to have good literacy and understanding politics. You have to be able to write effectively because it's still a text-based medium. Sure, you can make a video instead, but that's even a rarer skill to do it well. So I see lots of potential in spending a lot of time worrying about this, but actually an awful lot of our young people are totally left out of the digital world from the point of view of civics and politics, and in fact from the point of view of any sort of active or creative use, because a lot of use of the internet is very, very passive.
Well, I also think that we shouldn't define civic participation too narrowly. It's more than just about political activism, protests, and other forms of social activism. Political participation can involve any effort to promote good social relations. Coaching a Little League baseball team is civic participation. Going to church is civic participation. You mentioned communities where the kids don't use the library, but if you go in the summer, you go to the playground or a basketball court, they're out there. They're active. I have this theory about the adage about the mule, which says that you can carry a mule to the water, but you can't make him drink. Well, if you need the mule to pot of ground, it's going to have to consume some water. So it can't stop there. So it will eat because it has to eat. So let's just integrate the water with the food, and when it eats the food, it consumes the water. In other words, maybe we find the avenues that do, or where there is motivation to do something where we think there's a vacuum of civic participation and work through those avenues. Maybe if you create a new playground and people like it, but they can't use it unless they actually check out a library book. But let's come up with different kinds of ideas that will help, I think, promote greater social activities and activism.
Yeah, I also want to make a small point about volunteerism and young people, because I've led 3 institutions in which the vast majority of the students were working class, and they had to work and go to school. And they don't have the luxury of being able to take unpaid internships, volunteer jobs in the community, and have a lot of things on their resumes that other students do. Some of them desperately try to do that when they're not working so they can add some things to their resume. But I'm constantly writing letters of recommendations for my own students, explaining why they have a job on their resume and not a lot of, other kinds of participation. And I'm just impressed with the young people that work full-time, go to school, and try to do something, and understand that it's important for them to do. So I think we have to recognize that the vast majority of college students in this country work and go to school and don't have the luxury of this kind of suburban upper middle class model of where they're going to school and not and can do all these extra community things.
We have time for one more question. The gentleman here in the plaid shirt.
Oh, thank you. I'm Howard Moreland. I'm 66, collecting Social Security, and I spend a lot of time in front of the computer. Too much, according to my wife. 25 years ago, I was lobbying for arms control on Capitol Hill, and I discovered that the nation is severely polarized on every issue that we try to lobby on. And I was surprised to learn that there was one factor that determined more than any other factor which side somebody was going to be on, and it turns out to be population density. That we have an urban culture which has a certain set of values, and those seem to be the values that we were talking about today, but there's a whole nother half of the country based on low population density, which in many cases has the opposite of the values that we're trying to discuss, particularly on God, guns, gays, foreign intervention, federal government power, lots of things. They're just polar opposites, and it's just often described as a red state, blue state phenomenon. But the main thing about a red state is that it doesn't have big cities in it, and blue states do. It's not really a state thing. It's more of an urban versus non-urban thing. And I see us as 2 different countries that are sort of tolerate each other, but I don't think we have a lot of shared values.
Maybe it's because my twin sister lives in rural North Dakota that I have a completely different attitude about this, and I don't see their fundamental values as different. They may have an attitude about the guns and the Constitution, but they're far more involved in their community and in helping people in their community, and going to school board meetings and being supportive of their kids and being willing to pay taxes. I also saw it in rural Wisconsin, where the farmers in Wisconsin were prepared to pay heavy taxes to maintain a world-class university that they took great pride in, and expected not much more, even though some of them would have the opportunity to send their kids there, but certainly to the other universities, not much more than taking care of the young people in their state. And I did not, in at least my travels in this country and talking to people in rural areas where I've spent a lot of time in my career, not just in North Dakota, but paying attention to things like rural health care, I don't find the values different. Their political ideas may be different, but I don't find their community values different, or their commitments to community, or what they expect from the country or their states in terms of the opportunities they want for their kids.
Well, I do think that I agree with Dr. Shalala, but I do think that you find people with different political viewpoints and ideology plays a role there. But I also have this theory that if space is critical to peace. If you want a peaceful place, you create the space where people can sort of live within their means and parameters without interfering with others. We've always had the luxury in America of having a lot of space, and so people can live within their confines and enjoy their lifestyles and their different cultures and their different ideas without necessarily impinging on the others. So you made mention of the difference between an urban point of view and a suburban, more rural point of view. I think what may be lacking there is really rich debate in the country, and whether or not people are exposed to different ideas and different points of view in a way that's civil, and so that people can make rational, objective choices about what we think we really need, as opposed to having the luxury of always being fed what one has been inculcated with without necessarily appreciating that there's a world beyond those narrow views.
That was a good way. That was a good way to end, or at least.
Yeah, and we certainly have had civil discourse here today. I want to thank those of you in the audience for coming and for participating in such a wonderful fashion, giving us the benefit of really good questions. And will you please join me in thanking our panelists?